Salams, you're watching People's Dispatch, and this is the Daily Debrief coming to you, as always, from our studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani, and today on the show we have the latest from Sudan, where fighting is continuing and the humanitarian situation is getting worse in what is a long-running political stalemate. In the United States, Republicans are pushing legislation that loosens protections for children in the workforce. We try to understand who is bankrolling this proposed legislation and why. And also we follow up on our previous conversation on South Korean arms sales to the United States and why a recent interview by South Korean President Yoon is worrying not just for the peninsula but the wider region. First up, fighting has been on for almost a week in Sudan between two wings of the political establishment, the Sudanese armed forces on one side and the powerful paramilitary rapid security forces on the other. Conditions on the ground have worsened beyond initial expectations, and citizens are facing increasing shortages of essential commodities, including water and food. But perhaps more dangerously, there seems no attempt or concern between the belligerents or the international community, for that matter, to alter the status quo on the ground in Sudan. This is giving rise to the very real possibility of prolonged violent clashes between the two sides. This will only serve, of course, to heighten the difficulties faced by day-to-day Sudanese civilians. Prashant joins us in studio now with the latest. Prashant, almost a week since the latest fighting violence erupted in Sudan. What's the latest you're hearing?
Right, so Sudan, the reports are pretty bad because the fighting has progressively gone worse. Now, there have been at least 2 attempts at a ceasefire in the past week. The latest attempt was yesterday. There was an attempt to have a 24-hour ceasefire. We also need to remember that this is a month of Ramadan. Eid is almost approaching, so there's also another significance for ceasefire. But reports on the ground generally say that in some places, at least, the ceasefire is not held. There's been continuous firing from both sides, so that's actually a very problematic development. Equally, worrying is the fact that residents, especially from Khartoum, have been trying to leave the city because the humanitarian situation there has become really bad. There has been a considerable number of power outages. Water has become really scarce, so residents are kind of forced to go out and across the country, but especially in Khartoum, try to go out and scavenge for some of these resources. Right. In order to avoid this situation, many have tried leaving the city, but again, they're once again vulnerable to firing because both sides think that the people who are fleeing are in some way kind of combatants with the others. So there have been reports of residents being fired, etc. The overall death toll has come to approximately nearly 300 people, which is quite a lot, considering that technically this is supposed to be fighting between two wings of the security forces. But it's clearly affecting civilians in a large number. There are lots of reports, for instance, of medical facilities being hit. The report said I think over 70% of hospitals and clinics in Khartoum are out of order. There are also reports from the ground which say that in some cases that the medics are being specifically targeted in the sense that they're being kind of at gunpoint, being threatened. I believe the reports say that these are by the RSF, but are being kidnapped or threatened to sort of treat those members of the RSF who are injured. Of course, these are reports from the ground. We don't have the full details yet. But, very shocking. And if you look at many of the aid organizations, many of the medical organizations which have been talking about the situation, many of them have expressed their concern, the fact that they're not able to deliver some of these very essential resources. So all in all, a very, very difficult situation for the people in Sudan right now, because there seems to be no real solution as of now to the fighting. Of course, I guess back channel talks are on. Yeah. There have been, there's been some reports that Burhan, the head of the military, has said that there has to be negotiation at some point. But considering that both these ceasefires are not really taken off and that there really doesn't seem to be a winner at this point, both sides, are continuously fighting. So the RSF trying to take over control of key installations, key resources across the country. The army has deployed the air force as well. So keeping all of this in mind, it's very uncertain as of this point. When will we reach the situation for negotiations? Because both sides will want to gain some kind of a decisive advantage before they sit down, so that the other side can further be pushed into the ground. Important to remember, of course, that both of these are very powerfully armed forces. The army is, of course, the army. Yeah. The Rapid Support Forces is not just any paramilitary force. It has a long record of atrocities, of killings, and it also has a long record of looting and access to resources, which makes it quite well equipped. Also the fact that both these sides are supported by international players. It's believed that the RSF has the support of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Egypt of course backing the army. So all in all, it doesn't look like one of those situations which can easily be resolved as of now.
Prashant, one of the stands that pro-democracy forces had taken was that essentially the power struggle is between already establishment players, like we've mentioned several times on the show, and therefore perhaps that stalemate being perpetuated. So how are progressive forces being able to mobilize in response to the violence, and the neighborhood committees that have played such a major part, are they able to sort of come into action?
Right, that's a very important question. I mean, at one level, of course, forces of the left, the Communist Party, the resistance committees, they have made it very clear that this is not a moment for precipitate action of any sort. I mean, because it is actually literally gunfire that is taking place. So the strength of the protesters has always been their mass mobilization, their ability to bring out thousands of people. But this is not really a moment where you want to sort of endanger the life of citizens. So they advise people to sort of stay inside, not take any rash steps, take care of themselves. But also very important to note that many resistance committees are working very closely with doctors, trying to set up clinics, informal centers, something like that, which help treat some of the civilians who are kind of injured. So it's important to remember that the resistance committees are among the groups which are actually providing essential aid to people at this point, and that kind of strengthens the fact that while the military and the RSF and other players have been behaving in such an irresponsible, criminal manner, it nonetheless is the democratic forces, the revolutionary forces who are discharging the basic needs of humanity, or providing the basic needs of humanity which these authorities were supposed to provide. But at another level also, I think it really vindicates what these revolutionary forces have been saying for the longest time. And they have been saying this for many, many years. It's not like last 2 months. They have been saying this since 2019, that fundamentally, although the former dictator Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in April 2019, the fact that his regime and its enforcers continue to be in power, these revolutionary forces were very skeptical of those political parties which time and again engaged in negotiations with the military, with the military junta at that point, which included both these players, both the army and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. They were part of it. So the revolutionary forces were always critical of these negotiations. The revolutionary forces were the people who continuously said no compromise, no adjustments with the military junta. They were the people who continuously asked for accountability for the crimes of the junta, including the massacre by the RSF in June 2019. So it's important to remember when today Hemeti, the leader of the RSF, is conducting a civil war. He had already fired on Sudanese citizens in April his forces very brutally, and was never held accountable for it. We already know that Burhan, the chief of the army, was pretty much in control when that massacre took place. He was never held accountable for it. And the fact is, not only did the centrist political parties in Sudan engage with the military junta, the international players also, what is called the UNITAMS, the UN mission, the United States, all these players were perfectly happy to have these two, the junta, these two leaders, Burhan and Hemeti, be a key part of all these processes. So, the fact is that it is ultimately the masses on the ground, their leadership, which kept making the central point that these forces cannot be trusted, and these forces will not take Sudan in the right direction. And they have been proved completely right. And now the unfortunate part again is that even now the international negotiation process, the international players, even the regional parties will continue to keep saying that let's somehow try to bring these players together. And there's going to be there's probably going to be very little chance for accountability unless the demands of the left are met, which is that there has to be, those who have engaged in these kind of crimes need to be punished. There has to be a far more transparent and inclusive political process. All these demands very central even now when the war is taking place.
Any chance of the African Union taking a different stance?
But I think overall I don't think, because they don't often intervene in similar ways, and there is already a process, so I don't think that's really on the cards.
All right, thanks, Prashant. And we'll ask you to, of course, keep an eye on that situation, and we will, of course, keep bringing you updates on Daily Debrief, as we have been consistently since 2019, or well, actually, since we've been around. Next up, as a follow-up to their attack on the rights of women, not the least in the sphere of sexual and reproductive health, the Republican-led conservative establishment in the United States is now targeting children, more specifically, children who are engaged in the workforce. Legislators are attempting to push through changes at both state as well as federal levels that roll back labor laws regulations designed to ensure that kids are engaged in age-appropriate jobs, or at least have special protections when engaged in the general workforce. The previous year, that's 2022, in the United States, there was a 37% increase in child labor law violations. And in response, the establishment seems to have decided that the way forward is to loosen regulations rather than strengthen protection for these vulnerable children. Natalia Marquez joins us now via video conference. Natalia, first up, tell us please a little bit about these proposed changes that are being attempted to push through in Iowa and elsewhere in the US.
So several states have recently either passed legislation or made moves to pass legislation having to do with this issue of child labor exploitation. This is not anti-child labor exploitation legislation, though. This is actually legislation that will make it easier to exploit children in the workforce, lowers age restrictions, extends working hours for younger and younger kids, lowers restrictions or lifts restrictions on hazardous work. The most egregious of this legislation has come up in Iowa. That's SF 167. It recently passed the state Senate, and it runs the gamut, really. So it lifts the restrictions on hazardous work. It lowers the age for serving alcohol to adults, extends work hours for young kids, and this is really the kicker of the legislation. It actually grants immunity to the employers from civil liability for any injury or death that may happen to these young kids as they're working, right? So literally, if a child dies on the job, there's language in this bill that will grant immunity to the employer. So this is something that lobbying groups, that big business lobbying groups, and groups that are lobbying for corporations that employ low-wage labor, that's who's really bankrolling this legislation.
Right. How much really currently of an issue is child labor in the United States, and is Joe Biden's Democratic administration, Natalia, doing enough to counter these growing violations?
Well, child labor used to be much more of an issue, right? I think that when people think of child labor in the United States, at least, they're thinking of the 19th or 20th centuries. Now it's much less prevalent than it was back then, but child labor has recently been on the upswing, been on the uptick, right? So from the beginning of the 21st century, violations in child labor had been declining. But then in 2015, they began to rise again. In 2018, the Labor Department reported an almost 70% increase in illegal child employment, right? So these things are really on the uptick for whatever reason. Recently there has been some controversy around specific instances of child labor. So a subsidiary of Hyundai, the auto giant, came under fire for employing children in an auto plant in Alabama recently. And from that investigation, the New York Times did a huge expose on the exploitation, the illegal exploitation of migrant child workers in particular, who are young as 12 years old, working in dangerous jobs like construction and forgoing schooling because they just simply don't have the time, right? And recently, the largest sanitation company, or one of the largest sanitation companies for the meat processing industry, was fined $1.5 million for hiring over 100 children in hazardous work. This is really, really dangerous labor, like cleaning meatpacking equipment, literally equipment that has names like skull splitters or bone saws, these really dangerous pieces of equipment that children were working on illegally. And the Biden administration has been very slow to act. They've actually been warned several times about this issue of migrant worker exploitation in terms of child labor, and they've done nothing. They took a very long time to react. Recently the Biden administration or Biden officials sent a strongly worded letter to the meatpacking industry, urging them to not exploit child labor. This is not a threat of criminal charge. This is not a fine or a sanction. It's simply government officials essentially begging corporations to not exploit labor, even though this is illegal. It's a criminal offense. So it's really something that's being talked about more and more in the US.
All right, thanks very much, Natalia, for that update. And finally, for today, in an interview to news agency Reuters, just days ahead of the first state visit to the US by a Korean president in over a decade, Yoon Suk Yeol has opened up the possibility of South Korea providing military aid to Ukraine. The interview marks a significant shift in South Korea's long-standing policy against supplying arms or ammunition to war zones. And this isn't the only shift that Yoon has signaled. In fact, the interview with Reuters touches on several issues that will antagonize both Russia and China and further expand conflicts that threaten regional as well as global peace. Anish joins us now for a conversation on the realpolitik behind the rhetoric. Anish, carrying on from where we left off this conversation about South Korea and the United States, which becomes actually prime in the context of this interview with Reuters, first of all, take us through the key elements of that interview, and then we can talk a bit further about some of the more interesting or controversial things that Yoon has come out and said.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two big highlights is the biggest highlight, obviously, is the fact that Yoon is essentially ready to reverse the South Korean policy of like the long-standing policy of not sending arms to a war zone. And not only that, he's ready to reverse his own government's policy of not sending military aid to Ukraine as the conflict unfolded. So this shows that there is a certain readiness on the part of the Yoon administration to actually toe the U.S. line and start sending aid, arms in the manner of aid at least. And that has been the highlight of the interview. We have also seen him talk about Taiwan and trying to make Taiwan as an international issue when it's a matter of a disputed sovereignty at most between two different entities. So in that context, South Korea, which has pretty much no stake in Taiwan, is trying to put itself into the situation, into this dispute, for no other reason than maybe the US and perhaps even Japanese prodding over the issue. So this is essentially, and this coming, just less than a week ahead of his visit to the United States, which is, seen as this massive, at least a massive show of strength, or massive show of unity on the part of the US and the United and South Korea. Clearly shows us the kind of direction that he's trying to push South Korea into after years of maybe like more pragmatic foreign policy directives by successive governments, not just one. So this is essentially trying to completely tilt South Korea towards this situation where it will be an active participant to the tensions in the region, and not just on the Korean Peninsula, but also for the rest of the East Asian region.
Which is interesting, yeah. And there's, of course, also mention of war, actually, and the possibility and reactions to it. Clearly emphasizing the kind of divergence from previous conversations under previous regimes that we've had before on the show as well, Anish. But specifically, we know through the leaks that there has been quite a lot of pressure that South Korea and South Korean diplomats have been put under by Western allies to change its stance on military aid to Ukraine. It's a stance that the Kremlin has reacted to, saying this is not very nice, essentially, and also bringing Taiwan into the picture also antagonizes China. So what exactly is Yoon thinking at this point, Anish?
I think a little bit of domestic context is essential when we try to understand what Yoon is trying to do with his foreign policy. We're looking at a government that is rapidly losing popular support. Recent polls show that his administration's popularity is at a 6-month low. And at a time when South Korea is not necessarily doing badly in terms of economics and stuff, but is definitely being mismanaged on various fronts. We have seen that in the show, like be it when dealing with trade unions, or for that matter, dealing with the general cost of living crisis in the country. So when faced with this, we've seen more Western aligned countries take to a more aggressive foreign policy, and this is no different for South Korea. We're seeing a more aggressive step towards taking a very pro-US camp alignment in the region, and that is going to be significant, because this is not just making statements to appease the United States. These are proper policy issues that may alter the manner in which South Korea interacts with its neighbors in the region, and that is going to. So it is not just a matter for the Korean Peninsula, the Korean peace process. Obviously, Yoon has chucked that entire thing under the bus, but we are now seeing a situation where he's ready to jeopardize South Korean relations with China. He's ready to jeopardize South Korean relations with Russia, even two major superpowers in the region, in maybe to create a sort of nationalistic gains in his in his domestic front. So this is the situation that we are looking at, and it's a dangerous situation, because obviously we have seen South Korea's involvement in the region when it came to military involvement in the Vietnam War, and how destructive that can be, essentially speaking, and how it can only heighten tensions to a very belligerent situation in the region. And that is not going to be any different if Yoon decides to put South Korea into the Ukraine war or the dispute between China and Taiwan. And that is definitely going to become a bigger headache for everybody involved in the region. And it's not just tensions-wise or where you stand camp-wise, because it's going to affect everybody, not just in East Asia, but like the rest of the world as well. So this is something that that shows a certain, a belligerent tendency that is not very welcome. That should not be very welcome for the region.
Yeah, I think it's important also to note for those who might not be aware that, of course, the Kremlin's reaction included a statement saying that if this weapon supply or ammunition supply, South Korea is a large producer of artillery ammunition. If it goes through, then Russia will consider South Korea a participant in the ongoing war, and that, like Anish was pointing out, further complicates the region, the conflict, and makes it, even in more dangerous situation in terms of at least resolving it. Thanks very much for your time today, Anish. We'll see you again on Daily Debrief very soon, I'm sure. And that's a wrap on this episode of the Daily Debrief. From Anish, myself, and the entire team here at People's Dispatch, thank you very much, as always, for watching. We invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, where you can see details on these stories as well as all of the other work we do. And also get in touch with us. Contact our editorial collective on any issues that you might see related to these stories, or if you live in one of the regions affected by the stories we cover. Don't also forget to give us a follow on the social media platform of your choice. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, stay safe. Goodbye.